Collection of talks on Nokodemions teaching from Contact Reports from 700s17.
Contact Report 701.
Thank you, that is much more detailed than what I said. This clarifies a few things, but as you have already mentioned, these kinds of people will not be taught and will continue to display their stupidity as they have done up to now. Such creatures, as you call them, unfortunately lack not only intellect, reason, and intelligence, but also a healthy self-worth and decency, respect and regard for themselves. And, as it has been said since time immemorial, stupidity knows no bounds, and this is unfortunately widespread throughout the world, which also proves to be the case with the believers, the religions and sects, who believe, as I experience again and again, that the so-called New Testament of Christianity can be traced directly back to Emmanuel, and the Quran directly back to Muhammad, precisely that Emmanuel and Muhammad themselves would have talked and taught all the cheese that is written in the books. It does not want to be understood or accepted that neither of them had dictated or written even one letter themselves, but that all the books, false teachings, laws, commandments, and all the evils and wickednesses, wars, death sentences, murders, and destructions, etc., that came out of them were invented and fabricated afterwards by followers, believers and delusionists, etc. Emmanuel, as well as Muhammad, did not preach punishment or war, let alone wage it, as is claimed, for example, with regard to Muhammad, whose entire life story was falsified many times more than that of Emmanuel. With Muhammad there was no Sharia, no compulsory headscarf, no child marriage, no covering of the face, and many other things, as was invented long after his death, and books of lies were written from it. The teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad was the one and only teaching of the prophets, the Spirit teaching, which was given as teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and which also exists today in a whole series of books, whereby the two works, and Cup of Truth, were both taught by Emmanuel and Muhammad, but were neither understood nor lived by the people of those times. On the contrary, the entire teachings were profoundly falsified and so straightened out that murderous delusions arose, which could not be reconciled with the teachings or only in small parts, and caused enormous suffering, hardship, misery, wars, persecutions, deaths, murders, and destruction. One only has to think of the early and later persecutions and murders of Christians, as well as war campaigns, etc., as well as the Inquisition and other murderous events in the name of Christianity, and equally of the tremendous atrocities that were carried out unlawfully, mendaciously, and criminally in the name of Muhammad and his teachings. And this happened and still happens today, although neither Emmanuel nor Muhammad ever taught in this way, but, like all prophets before them, consistently adhered honorably and worthily to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and did not misteach anything about domination, lust for power, inhuman punishment or capital punishment, child marriage, mummery, war, conquest, torture, human trafficking and the like or other nonsense, imbecility, and other time-honored inhumanities.
Contact Report 703.
Maybe you can compare it to that. But now I would like to talk a little bit in detail and openly about how basically the so-called holy books came into being with regard to Christianity and Islam, because the truth is that neither Emmanuel alias Jesus nor Muhammad themselves made any written records of the teachings of the prophets. Only Emmanuel's disciple Judas Iscariot, not Judas Iscariot or Ishariot, knew the scriptures, while all the other disciples, contrary to all the conventional lies and claims, were just as ignorant of the scriptures as the followers around Muhammad. The records of Judas Iscariot, from which the book Talmud Emmanuel was made, were finally translated into German by those who knew the scriptures, after Isa Rashid had falsified everything according to his priesthood. The Christian New Testament, however, has no connection whatsoever with the actual records of Judas Iscariot, for this corresponds to a work of lies whose origin lay long years after the time of Emmanuel and Judas Iscariot in letters of the disciples, etc., which began to circulate and from which the so-called New Testament was also finally made. These disciples' letters, however, were not written by the disciples themselves, who knew how to write and write, but were written works of scribes, to whom various disciples, etc., dictated their statements according to the time of Emmanuel, which were interpreted by the scribblers according to their own discretion and sense, and were formulated and written accordingly. In the process, fanciful or misinterpreting things and events were added that lacked any truth content. This also happened with the Hebrews and their descendants when the first Torah and then the second Torah were written, from which the Christian Bible ultimately emerged. These holy works were also not written according to the real truth, but according to ancient stories, fables and legends, etc., which, as with all peoples of the earth, were based on assumptions, beliefs, hallucinations, fantasies, delusions, fairy tales, hopes, dreams, and wishes, which were nurtured by human beings over decades and centuries or even millennia. And just as the Torah, the Bible and the New Testament came about, so it was also with the Quran, which was never written after the teachings of Muhammad, but very long after his death by human beings who had neither seen the Prophet himself, nor heard his teachings, nor known him themselves. Also, with Muhammad, it was in truth the case that no written records of his life and teachings were made during his lifetime, but such records only came into being long decades after his death, with tremendous mendacious claims, tall tales, and false doctrines being set up, which in no way corresponded to the truth regarding the reality of Muhammad's teachings and life. Everything about his personality, his behavior, and the doctrine of the prophets that he brought and taught was so thoroughly falsified and made into a religion that brings death and destruction to this day. The entire life story concerning Muhammad and his work has been so maliciously falsified that hardly a word corresponds to the effective reality. Muhammad neither taught nor waged wars, and those that were carried out in his name were against his will and the work of war-obsessed delusional believers who, on the one hand, misunderstood the teachings, reinterpreted them themselves, and thus falsified them. On the other hand, they used their doctrine-distorting and doctrine-ballooning for them useful, doctrine-twisting and doctrine-manipulating, deliberately fallish interpretations to further their warmongering, and to be able to attribute the whole thing to the teaching and meaning of Muhammad. So they used their doctrine-distorting interpretations for their warmongering favors and advantages, completely contrary to the teachings of Muhammad, who taught neither hatred, capital punishment, and child marriage, nor Sharia, and such nonsense, hostilities to life and inhumanities. Lying and deceitful, as it has always been since time immemorial, and the whole thing has been preserved up to the present day. It was also easy for all those who invented his life story and devalued, disfigured, distorted, and twisted it in such a way in relation to Muhammad, to falsify everything in a slanderous way, that only a short time later it was no longer possible to verify anything, and today it is no longer possible at all. Because the effective truth about the person of Muhammad, his way of life, his teachings, and his behavior in terms of morals, ethics, and customs, as well as his worldly conduct, can no longer be verified today, precisely because of the old mendacious records and false chronological annals. The delusion of lies and slander surrounding his personality, teachings, and behavior, etc., can no longer be eradicated. On the contrary, with regard to all the stories of lies and slander around Muhammad and his teachings, everything has become so ingrained in the Islamophobes and also in the Islam believers themselves that the effective truth is no longer accepted, but is reviled as lies and conspiracy theories. So it is also not accepted that the teaching of the prophets, or the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as it was already brought by Emmanuel and all 4 other prophets or heralds, Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, which is now also taught today for the last time and spread by the Figu, is a teaching of the creative natural laws. A teaching that teaches the human being to live with all fellow human beings and all peoples in peace, freedom, and justice, in humanity and love. And this ancient teaching, whose origins can be traced back to Nokodemion, the universal herald who existed 9 billion years ago, also teaches that self-knowledge, consciousness self-development, good self-esteem, empathy, and healthy self-respect, etc., are of the greatest importance for the individual human being, as well as connectedness with the existence of the entire environment. The fact is, however, that with regard to Muhammad and his teachings of the prophets, unfortunately, all evil was included in the once created falsifications by delusionists, those who were greedy for power, murder and war and other delusional elements, starting with murder and manslaughter, human trafficking, child abuse, war, exploitation, torture and capital punishment, up to and including many other evils and human degradations. And out of this came religious wars and conquests in the name of faith and the ruler of heaven, etc. Child abuse was also commonplace long before the time of Muhammad the Annunciator, as was also the case with the ancient Hebrews, about which, however, silence is deliberately kept. Muhammad had denounced this through his teachings, but never succeeded in having his request for a ban on child marriage respected, even to this day. On the contrary, this part of his teaching was also falsified and denied ad infinitum, and it was even maliciously imputed to him that he himself had at least entered into a child marriage, which was later allegedly confirmed by his wife in this regard, but which was never actually the case. In truth, this child marriage lie was already rampant very early on in the first slanderous oral, and then also in the first written traditions, which then also found its way into the invented and falsified life story of the prophet or annunciation, and has been preserved up to the present day. But as far as the acts of war and the great bloodshed are concerned, which resulted from the falsifications of the teachings of the prophets, everything happened in the same way in the Christian world, because also in Christianity the teachings of the prophets, or the teachings of truth, teachings of the Spirit, teachings of life, which Emmanuel brought, had led to catastrophes through lies, deceit, and falsifications. So everything happened in the same way also in the Christian world, which led enormous war campaigns, which were even driven from Europe to Jerusalem, unleashed the Inquisition, and brought unspeakable suffering and misery as well as immense hardship and innumerable deaths upon the human beings. But the whole life story of Muhammad and the teachings of the prophets he brought were thoroughly distorted beyond recognition, and turned into a false doctrine for hatred, war, death, subjugation, ruin, and destruction. Muhammad and Emmanuel, however, were in reality humble human beings of love, peace, freedom, justice, equality, and humanity, as were also the other, earlier and predetermined prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah from the same prophetic line before them. And, as I said, the old four prophets were predestined from time immemorial, as were Emmanuel and Muhammad, because they were prophets born of earth mothers from the nations, and therefore not sons of God, not chosen by a God, and not servants of God, or such nonsense as was attributed to them in the course of time by crazy and delusional people. Enoch, Eliah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel and Muhammad were predetermined prophets or heralds of the doctrine of the prophets, or the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life, which was created ages ago by the ever-first prophet or herald Nokodemion, according to the creative natural laws, and carried on in his spiritual lineage reincarnating over all times. But in addition to the prophets or heralds of the Nokodemion lineage, wise human beings, female and male, also always arise in all peoples, who acquire much creative natural knowledge by their own efforts and instruct the peoples, guide them and teach them the true ways of creative natural conduct of life.
What you explain also corresponds to our records of the last millennia regarding the vast earthly history of mankind, prophets, and religions. In addition, I can mention that, of all the earth humans who have brought and spread a doctrine or false doctrine in earlier or more recent times, quite confused religions and sects have arisen, some of which still exist today. Without exception, Completely false life stories were deliberately invented for those who brought the teachings, the prophets, heralds, sages, and knowers, as well as confused, changed, and dangerous new teachings and false doctrines that had little or no connection with the original teachings and false doctrines. Consequently, since the thousands of years during which we have been observing the earth and earth humans and registering all that is necessary and important, there is no religion and no sect that is still formed in the way it was brought according to the original teachings or false doctrines. Also, every life story and teaching of every prophet, herald, knower, or sage has been so maliciously and wantonly falsified after their death by chroniclers, etc., who know how to write, and by delusionists, that only extremely little or nothing at all of every life story of a prophet, sage, philosopher, and other great thinkers and their teachings now corresponds to what the earlier life story or teaching corresponded to. But this is not surprising, for in the earlier days, when the art of writing was reserved for the higher classes, records of events, chronicles, etc., were not checked by higher authorities for their correctness. This was still the case until more than 1,500 years ago, when Earth humans who knew how to write were still a rarity and could only be found among rulers and in higher educated circles of various kinds, while the common peoples themselves had no or only extremely rare opportunities to learn the art of reading and writing. And even after this, when 1,500 years ago the development brought about that Earth humans, also from among the peoples, became interested in writing, the great masses of peoples, which also included the craftsmen and those fighting in the armies, etc., remained ignorant of writing for a long time, for they remained generally illiterate and were not seldom even hostile to the art of writing. Today's earthly chroniclers and scholars of historical norms do not want to accept all these facts as truth, but they vehemently deny them and believe in the completely false oral and written traditions that have run through the entire earthly history of mankind since time immemorial. Subsequently, all those who doubt false chronistic and other records and traditions or can even prove their falsity and truthfulness, which were already thoroughly falsified at the time of the events and happenings with regard to their written records by the scribes' own interpretations, are insulted as liars, know-it-alls, troublemakers, and malicious conspiracy theorists. And such false and falsified chronicles, traditions, and records have existed since time immemorial, and thus go back to far before antiquity, although such also occur after the 14th Christian calculated century and even reach into the present time and will also continue to appear. Often such chronistic records and traditions also involved quite deliberate lies and information fraud, as is still the case today and will probably remain so. You experience this yourself through all the lies and slander that are spread about you. Your mission and contacts with us Pleiaren in newspapers, on television, radio, in journals, and at specially organized hearings and lectures. And the fact is that these lies and calumnies have already found their way into many works of writing, books, and even encyclopedias, and will be preserved until the distant future. Consequently, it is also a chronistic form in this respect, which is based on deliberate lies and deceit, whereby the people of Earth will be misled far into the future.
Contact Report 704.
Florina and Injana have sent me some questions from you, as well as the long list of questions from Christian. To such questions I have already told you once that you should not go into them any more, because they are absolutely irrelevant for the mission and therefore for the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and therefore also of no importance and therefore not relevant with regard to the learning and knowledge of the teaching of truth, teaching of life, as well as the whole mission. Besides, such questions, On the one hand, give rise to further endless, irrelevant, unimportant, and only curiosity-serving new questionings, by which, on the other hand, if you answer them, you spend yourself uselessly, whereby, by answering you also fail to do more important work, as would also be the case if you were to engage in such a way with journalists, etc. And just in this respect I want to tell you that you should continue to keep to it, really not to indulge in any more public relations of this or also of any other kind. What has had to be done in this respect, as in relation to some good journalists worthy of their profession, and the work with Wendell Stevens, Tom Welch, and Lee Elders, etc., as well as Japan television and the Contact film, that should be quite enough and not be repeated another time. You have done your necessary work in this respect at the time you began to spread and publicize your mission, and it has been done by you in a good, sufficient, and satisfactory manner. Consequently, nothing need be done by you again in the same or similar form. All public work of this kind is to be done and carried out only by your faithful, while you are to remain in the background. There would be no objection to such work and assignments of your faithful if you had to assist them with advice as well as missionary and consequently also doctrinal explanations.
Question 6. The levels High Council as well as Arahat Athersata to Patah Li most probably also exist in every other universe or creation universal consciousness, but are probably called by other names by the human beings living there, right?
Answer. The levels High Council as well as Arahat Athersata to An Patah Li exist. As already explained in answer 3, in every creation universal consciousness. The terms, names, designations and words used on earth in relation to the teaching of the prophets, the teaching of the Spirit, that is to say the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life correspond to those used by the prophet chart enunciator Nokodemion in his language, and which have been transposed by me according to today's German understanding of the language. Consequently, it should be clear that human beings and other life forms of other worlds and languages that are capable of articulating use other terms, names, designations and words than those that I have implemented and use from the vocabulary of Nokodemion. In the earthly languages alone, translations have to take place, but for certain terms, names, designations and words in other earthly languages, there are often no translation possibilities, because these are very poor in expression and lack the extensive possibilities of the German language variety of terms, designations and words.
Question 7. You have already confirmed once that there is a universal founder in every universe, so also in the Tao universe. But is it also the case in every other universe that the designated universal enunciator already gathers human beings around him in his first phase of existence? That is to say, before he first enters the Arahat Athersata plane, teaches them and of course also begets offspring himself, so that spirit-teaching peoples develop from them, and thereby the chance of an acceleration of evolution arises for human beings in the universe concerned?
Answer. This question contains more than just a simple question. Consequently, it also requires a far more detailed answer, because in its entirety, this question conceals a whole complex of questions that must be answered by getting to the bottom of it. 1. With regard to the term universal conjurer, it must be clearly explained that this term is obviously misunderstood, because a universal prophet or universal conjurer is a human being who is born on a world where he or she forms himself or herself to be a prophet or a preacher, and is active on his or her own planet as a prophet or preacher, and thus spreads the teachings he or she has worked out. Basically, the teachings are not taught and spread throughout the universe, but on one's own world. 2. What is to be understood with regard to the universal? This means that the teaching must be universal, that is to say, universe-wide. That is to say, creatively, universally valid, and founded in the universal laws and commandments of creation, universal consciousness. The universal thus clearly states that the prophetic preaching and wise teaching is equally given, definitely established, binding, obligatory, unquestionable, and correct and indisputable according to the laws of creation. 3. In rare cases, as is the case with Nokodemion, the universal prophet or universal herald actually carries the prophetic heraldic activity out into the universe and thus spreads the teaching universally on other worlds than just on the home planet. Only in this way can a prophet universal enunciator be called universally active, which is a rarity, because in order to be active as a universal prophet's universal enunciator in this way, the absolute condition must be fulfilled that space travel must be given and mastered. Every prophet universal enunciator, as well as every other true prophet enunciator, gathers human beings around him in order to instruct them, because this is, after all, his task and duty. In the case of a universal prophet / universal enunciator, his activity in spreading his teaching to other worlds is always dependent on the extent to which he has the possibility of reaching other planets to carry out his teaching. So there are prophets, founders, who could be active in a universal way, because they would be universal prophets, founders, according to their knowledge, their insights and wisdom. But they cannot practice universal prophethood founding, because they do not have the necessary possibilities to reach other worlds. With regard to Nokodemion, the whole thing was a special case, in that there was already a very high level of technical development among his peoples in his time, which enabled them to go out into the vastness of the universe, and even penetrate into other dimensions. This also happened in such a way that the Nokodemion teaching, or the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, was brought to earth and can also still be taught today. Very often universal prophets, founders, or even sages remain planet-bound because they lack all possibilities to be able to work in the vastness of the universe. Consequently, they spread their knowledge as prophets, founders on their world alone, and as a rule also teach only one people.
Explanation with regard to prophets and heralds.
In principle, every rational and rational human being is capable of perceiving everything in free nature and its fauna and flora, of observing it closely, and of recognizing from it the creative natural laws and commandments in order to use them in a consequent positive way for himself, to create creatively naturally within oneself the values of morality, ethics and morality correctly, in order to then live these outwardly as correct forms of morality, ethics and morality through correspondingly positive behavior, actions and deeds, commandments related to the understanding and reason of human beings, recommendations. In relation to the creative natural commandments, the commandments correspond to causality or the consistency of cause and effect. The consistency of cause and effect, note, ethics, morality, ethos, moral attitude. If the human being follows the creative natural laws and commandments, which he independently recognizes and learns in free nature and its fauna and flora, and in all creative natural existence, then he gradually becomes a knowing and wise human being who first of all uses his knowledge and wisdom for his own benefit. 2. But also passes on his knowledge and wisdom to his fellow human beings. And this passing on takes place in various ways. On the one hand, through education, in which the acquired knowledge and its essence or wisdom is imparted to the offspring or other children as well as adults. On the other hand, the acquired knowledge and the wisdom resulting from it are passed on through simple conversations in which the acquired knowledge is interwoven, But the whole of knowledge and wisdom is also passed on in schools and through lectures, books, writings, courses of instruction, and public proclamations. And if this fact is considered carefully, then every normal human being, male or female, is more or less a prophet, herald, and teacher. If the human being acquires the necessary knowledge and the resulting essence, the wisdom, through understanding and reason, and then passes on the whole of his learning in this respect to his fellow human beings in some good, positive, and valuable way, and also explains the natural creative laws, then he is a teacher or herald. If he also explains in a comprehensible way the causality or the effect that inevitably arises from a cause, then this corresponds to a factor that is prophesied according to acting and arriving facts, and is consequently called prophetic and predicted as something future, which, however, has nothing to do with fortune-telling, because prophecy is based on facts of causality. A prophet prophesies the truth among human beings and explains what results from a cause as an effect, whereby a warning is given, prophetically or prophesying or predicting, to turn back to the better and the good if bad consequences and evil degenerations, etc., will result from a cause through wrong thoughts, actions, and deeds. And if we look at the whole thing in this way, then we must understand that every normal human being who has a clear mind and clear reason, who also has a good general knowledge and the resulting wisdom concerning the creative and natural laws and commandments and their work and causal effects, is also a herald if he brings his wisdom to the attention of his fellow human beings and teaches them. And such a human being is also a prophet if he understands and uses the creative natural commandments and causality in order to prophesy and explain their work to his fellow human beings. Thus, prophetically, that is to say, prophesying, it is prophesied or predicted what will ultimately result from a certain evil, negative, bad, evil cause as an even worse and worse effect, if after the bad created cause is continued in the same negative framework, which then inevitably results in the effect.
Question 10. Of the peoples living in the Dal universe, the Sonar are known to us as the most highly evolved people. Are they given the knowledge of the universal founder spirit form, responsible for their universe? Or are they even aware of the bearer or bearer, if any, in life from the universal founder spirit form lineage there?
Answer. The Sonar are the most evolved peoples in the Dal universe, to which Ptah explained the following during a conversation he once had in private. The Sonaya peoples are the oldest known to us, and have been living in peace since time immemorial in the Dal universe. They also had prophets and heralds at a very early time, but in a different way than in the Dern universe, because at a very early time the Sonaya peoples had two wise men, namely a prophetess or herald who was called Nese, while the prophet or herald was called Alkan. The Taimars split off from the Sonaya peoples and formed themselves into a separate line of peoples, whereby they continued to cultivate the teachings of the old sages Nese and Alkan. In later times, they mixed with distant ancestors from ancient Pleiadian families who came to the Dal universe and joined forces with the Taimars. As a result, the teaching of Nokodemion also reached the Timars and the Sonayan. And because this teaching harmonized with that of Nesa and Alkan, the two largely identical teachings were combined and henceforth taught among the Taimars and Sonaya peoples, and adhered to up to the present time, and will undoubtedly be adhered to in the future for all time. Fundamentally, then, it can be said that the prophetic heraldic teaching of the Sonea and Timos is identical with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as taught from time immemorial and also brought to earth through the Nokodemion series of prophets.
Question 13. Until the time has come, from now until about 1980 years from now, those human beings who are carriers of the Nokodemion spirit form will probably still make many valuable contributions to the cultural and consciousness-related, etc., development of humanity. The effects of the persons listed in question 11 will probably continue to make many valuable contributions to the cultural and consciousness development of humanity.
Most probably, they will continue to be active and work after relatively short interruptions in their stay in the hereafter.
And possibly these human beings will also come into contact with the Figu on various occasions. Can it be assumed that in such a case, the carrier of the Nokodemion spirit form in question will make himself known to the Figu in a way that does not allow for deception after all?
It is to be expected that freeloading swindlers will make their appearance, as in the case of the various fraudulent or delusional Jesus Christ revenants, etc.
Answer. Through the level Arahat Athersada, it was foreseen that under certain circumstances the spirit form of Nokodemion would appear again in the future through a new successor personality, but not as a prophet annunciator, but in a different function. In the future, the learners of the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, should have the opportunity to recognize this successor personality of the sevenfold Nokodemion prophet conjurer lineage. However, these certain circumstances have not been fulfilled in the time given by the level Arahat Athersada. Consequently, the whole of the succession personality appearing in a different capacity, which was to be born at an unspecified time between the years 2050 to 2075, has not been fulfilled. It was foreseen that the new personality would become recognizable as a bearer of the Nokodemion spirit form when the circumstances had been fulfilled, which related to a certain high value of Earth-human evolution with regard to morals, ethos, ethics and manners, and the values and behavior that emerge from this externally. If this evolution had found its beginning by the beginning of the new third millennium in the first important outlines concerning worldwide efforts for peace, freedom and justice, which, however, had not been achieved, then the aforementioned was revoked as unrealizable and put out of force. It was explained that all that had been distributed in written form to renowned media and governments worldwide since the 1940s had not brought any success, but had been ignored by all those responsible on Earth, and consequently not one iota of all predictions had been used to bring about a change for the better. The conclusion of all this is that in the future, new personalities will appear who will be born as new Nokodemion spirit form carriers, but will remain unrecognized and will also no longer be active in announcing the future. Consequently, it is also absolutely impossible that if free riders appear and are therefore imposter persons, they can be animated by the Nokodemion spirit form. If, however, it should nevertheless happen in the future that human beings should allow themselves to appear as free riders, as Nokodemion spirit form bearers and successor prophets, and in this way reveal themselves as prophets and heralds of the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, then it is clear from the outset that they are impostors and absolutely lying false teachings. This time's bringing of teachings in the last century of the second millennium, and at the beginning of the first century of the third millennium according to the calendar since the ministry of Emmanuel, is and remains the very last in the sevenfold Nokodemion lineage. This teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life of the Nokodemion will also not be followed by any new, further or supplementary teaching, according to which this teaching will effectively only continue to exist according to what was brought in the seventh line of the prophet causation up to the first time of the third millennium in terms of teaching, and actually spread worldwide in an oral and written manner through the immeasurable assistance of all members of the core group and passive group of the Figu. And finally, it is still to be explained that, on the one hand, the further new successors from the last Nokodemion lineage will remain aware of all their missionary knowledge until the time of finding their way back to the plane Arahat Athersata in the year 3999. It has been envisaged that the successor personalities who will continue to retain all their missionary knowledge in relation to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, will, however, no longer be openly prophetic announcing, but will only be active in other ways unrecognized and in the background as personalities originating from the Nokodemion lineage. So it will also not be that they will come out as such in Figu circles, absolutely never. Consequently, it can be absolutely ruled out in any way that any free riders can ever appear, because such can be ruled out 100% as successor personalities throughout. The subsequent new personalities from the Nokodemion spirit form lineage will continue to remain on Earth after the completion and termination of the sevenfold Nokodemion lineage mission, but they will leave it temporarily, because these personalities will also continue to be in contact with the Pleioran. And this will also be the case when the Pleioran finally return to their space-time dimension in 2029, and will no longer have any effect on Earth in any way.
Question 15. What about the extension of the mission time of those faithful whose further evolution into the half-spirit plane High Council has been slowed down or influenced by the spirit plane Arahat Athersata to such an extent that they can now support the universal founder in the mission far longer than the standard duration of 40 to 60 million years in the material world? Is their future duration of action synchronized with that of the universal covenanter, or does it end at an earlier time at which point new faithful are found and committed? They commit themselves, of course.
Answer. From the year 3999, when the spirit forms of the members or faithful of the mission migrate to another higher evolutionary world and to its humanity, the continuation of the standard duration of 40 to 60 million years in the material world begins, which means that the further time will be counted from that which is then authoritative through the present evolutionary state of the spirit forms and personalities concerned. The lengthening of the missionary period is therefore not a disadvantage, but an advantage, because evolution will result in great progress. New members or faithful with regard to the continuation of the mission will no longer appear, because from the year 3999, as is determined by the level Arahat Athersata, humanity on Earth must continue to develop independently in every respect according to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, or perish.
I can understand these questions and explain the following. We did not consider direct contact with state officials, the U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military for various reasons, which I will explain a little. First and foremost, direct and open contact with those responsible in the United States of America was not possible because, according to our directives, such action or direct contact with Earth or with Earth governments, military and secret services, and other organizations is just as forbidden as direct contact with Earth humans. The only exception was when Petra and Anatol were involved in a contact connection, who, according to your instructions, should have assisted you. This connection ended. However, after Eva had brought you to the two of them in Huningen in Alsace, where you were to discuss with them their work, which they were to have taken on, but which unfortunately did not happen, because some time after your meeting, both of them fell victim to an unforeseen fatal car accident, and the planned enterprise was thereby rendered invalid.
Note: Huningen equals French. Huningi Alsatian Hinig High Alemannic or Heininge. Low Alemannic is a French municipality with about 7,000 inhabitants as of March 2018 in the Haut-Rhin department in the Grand Estate region until 2015 Alsace, and belongs to France. To the Canton Saint Louis. The neighboring French municipalities of Huningen are Saint Louis and Village Neuve. In Huningen, the Canal de Huningi branches off from the Rhine, with the Swiss Klein Huningen, an urban outskirt of Basel, lying to the right of the Rhine. Huningen is directly adjacent to the Swiss city of Basel and the southern Baden city of Weil am Rhein in the Federal Republic of Germany, directly in the border triangle of Germany, Switzerland, France. Together with its directly adjacent neighboring town of Larac, the whole forms a regional center.
Earth humans other than Petra and Anatole were and are not allowed according to our directives for direct contacts nor indirect ones. This, however, if we disregard the evolutionary development impulse contacts or impulse information, which we have been radiating extensively to the whole Earth since the 16th century and which were so directed, towards the development and progress of all very important technical apparatus and devices, and continue to be programmed in this way, that they came directly into the consciousness of earthly inventors, researchers and scientists. As a result, an extremely rapid and far-reaching technical development took place in many diverse electronic data processing areas, which would otherwise have taken a development process of well over 130 years. This, however, could not be justified, because your mission was providently based on the electronic development resulting from the evolutionary development impulses, which had to be geared towards you being able to produce, record, and disseminate your teaching work and teaching instruction in written form in a good and preserving manner. So the bringing and spreading of the manifold and very wide-ranging teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life required a high electronic technical development, especially related to computer technology, which enabled you to do your wide-ranging works, recordings, explanations, expositions, and the written recording of the manifold teachings. Without the entire technical development of this kind, which could only come about through our efforts to transmit impulses to earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists, it would have been impossible for you to record your teaching work and mission in writing and to disseminate it worldwide in the way that it has come about. And everything had to be like this, for the whole of the teaching had, on the one hand, finally to be recorded well and correctly and comprehensively in the modern world, and on the other hand to be spread globally, for only in this way was there a possibility that the same unpleasant thing would not happen as in the days of the earlier heralds, who only brought the teaching orally and thus hardly achieved any success. And this led to the fact that their teachings were falsified over decades and centuries in a constantly orally handed-down manner and passed on as oral traditions, after which they were later recorded in completely unrealistic and untruthful outgrowths, distortions, false assertions, and confused interpretations as true teachings of the prophets, etc., by completely untruthful handing-down memories by those who knew the scriptures. But this had to be prevented this time, which is why the necessary technical preconditions had to be created so that you could write down yourself everything that was relevant to your missionary work and record the whole thing in writing, which could only happen by enabling the necessary evolutionary impulse transmissions into the consciousness of earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists. These then developed the necessary apparatus and devices which you could use and, by recording the teaching in writing, transmit it yourself unaltered for all time. You were supposed to write 8 books for this purpose, but you exceeded this number by far, and consequently you have written a total of almost 70 instructive books. But to go on to say what arises with regard to direct and indirect contacts and connections between us and Earth humans, the only exception relates to you, for which the reasons known to you are based extensively in your mission and time-honored origin of your spirit form. Although it is possible for us to contact the earthly leaders, military and secret services, etc., indirectly through purely technical means of communication, it is really only as an alternative solution, because we can only consider a communicative technical form due to the blatant difference in vibration between us and the Earth humans, which is why we could not enter into a direct contact solution and also could not do so in the future. This in addition to other things, such as because it is well known to us since the existence of the United States of America that all those U.S. Americans who were in positions of power in the state leadership, the military and the secret services, etc., have always, without exception, exercised a malicious insidiousness, scheming, deceitfulness, aggressiveness, and belligerence, as well as betrayal, and have always exercised a profound desire for power, as well as a desire for domination, a breach of promise, and a desire to rule over their allies, who are always only expedient for them. And this was already the case at the earliest and most fundamental times, when George Washington, before he advanced to become the first U.S. president, had a white-flagged French negotiating troop treacherously shot dead. And because these facts are not known to today's U.S. people, but also to the majority of the Earth's population, the majority of U.S. supporters from all over the world have always been unthinkingly in favor of the state powers, military and secret services, etc. of the United States of America. However, as in all ancient times, all leaders, military, secret services, and all organizations of the USA today are equally afflicted with world power addiction, injustice, warmongering, and unconscionability, as it was also at the time when we chose you as mediator between U.S. America and U.S., and that they are extremely suspicious when it comes to their alleged state security is also known to us, as is also the fact that, in truth, there is a profound fear of losing control over the entire U.S. population and thus also over the country itself. Especially this fear leads to a self-suggestive martial basic behavior in every single human being of the governing, military and secret services, as well as in the police, security forces and special task forces, etc. of the USA, as is also the case with the members of criminal organizations, such as in the USA, among others, the Ku Klux Klan, the U.S. Mafia, that is to say, La Cosa Nostra, the Hells Angels, and the Aryan Brotherhood. And just as these criminal organizations are predisposed, so are the rulers, the military and secret services, as well as all those from all strata of the population who, as fellow travelers, act without hesitation within the same framework and indulge in inhumane and inhuman behavior, while that part of the righteous population who rejects all unjust machinations of the rulers, as well as security forces, etc., has nothing to say. So if we had openly approached the U.S. government, we would inevitably have come into conflict with the U.S. military and intelligence services, as well as with various criminal organizations, especially those that are fundamentally xenophobic and racist in their delusions. This, while other similar organizations, as well as the government, military and secret services, would have been out to get hold of our technology, which would inevitably have led to degenerate actions with deadly weapons and even to effective warlike degenerations, which would not have led to great hardship and suffering for us, but to much misery for the population of the USA, as well as death, destruction, and unimaginable devastation throughout the country. Also, great hatred would have been unleashed against us by many xenophobic upper elites in the USA, as well as nationwide anarchy would have arisen and epidemics would have broken out, as calculation forecasts have shown. But also many other very hard, difficult, and malignant factors, as these were warningly mentioned in the calculation forecasts in our directives, and were to be followed without question, have prevented us from seeking a direct contact for the Earth or Earth humans and from having a teaching effect on them via the USA, in order to bring Earth humans onto a path which should have led globally to peace. Unfortunately, this attempt was already nipped in the bud by the first of our efforts to contact the U.S. government, through your mediation and that of EL, due to impossible, arrogant and megalomaniac demands, as a result of which we refrained from further efforts and will never make another attempt. For Earth and earthly humanity, the opportunity to achieve global peace has been blocked by the pathological self-importance of the U.S. government. The pathological megalomania of those responsible for the rejection of our attempt at contact in the USA clearly prove to us that it will not be possible for us Plejaren to enter into indirect contact in any other form with those responsible for the state of the USA or with any Earth governments or Earth humans at all.
Note, Billy, megalomania is to be understood as a pathological delusion of grandeur, which corresponds to a cognitive distortion through overvaluation of one's own intellect, one's own reason, and one's own abilities and competences, but which is also connected with a pathological overestimation of oneself, self-importance, arrogance, and with pride, as a result of a delusion of self-exaltation, in which the human being believes himself to be great, powerful, master of all things, and an important personality, and in this gigantomania delusion displays a maliciously dominating striving as well as bossiness, and putting himself above all human beings, and despising his fellow human beings, whereby these are supposed to be surpassed by the allegedly great and high achievements of the megalomaniac.
This means, however, that through the shameful failure of the USA, with regard to our attempted establishment of contact through you, their old-fashioned world dominion-addicted and self-important condition will be carried on just as the enmity of many Earth humans and their wars among each other will continue in the old style and also in the future bitterly evil events, and very much disaster will befall the world and Earth humans. And now it is still to be explained why we asked you only to mediate with the United States of America, but not with the USSR. For the reason was solely that, at that time, only the USA was big and strong enough to become active on a global scale in accordance with our intended task, while the Soviet Union had largely collapsed and was incapable of fulfilling such a task as we had intended. On the contrary, the USA, in contrast to the USSR, had all the necessary means and all the other necessary possibilities at that time to act according to our instructions and to include the USSR in the whole process in a completely peaceful way. If the megalomania, the imperiousness as well as the self-importance of the state leaders of the USA had not opposed our peaceful, well-considered and selfless attempt with vituperative, nonsensical, and arrogant, as well as senseless and unreasonable demands. And these demands were so marked by self-importance, megalomania, lust for power and domination that we had to recognize that these unvalues were far too deeply rooted and the whole negative and malignant degenerations to it were so marked that they could not have been changed for the better, the good and the correct even by our teachings in useful time.
Contact Report 706.
Then I will do it the way I am comfortable with it at the moment. Good. Thanks. Then I wanted to say further that I know about your person and mission, and that our Aran population knows you very well. because much of what you teach from the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, that is also spread among us. It is true that this teaching has also always been our teaching, but we can still learn much from your works, which you also write for us, Plearin, even if these are only smaller parts of what you finish for our spirit leadership, as is generally known among us.
Quinto, you say that religious influences are also brought into all state systems. I can also imagine that, because all religious sectarianism has crept into everything imaginable on Earth. But I have a question about this in relation to your daughter Bermunda, because when I spoke to her on the 14th of March, I noticed that she is not very keen on religions, their sects, on religiosity, belief in God and religious faith, etc.
Which you are right about, because Bermunda has been preoccupied with everything that is religion-related since she was a child, be it in terms of a major religion in and of itself, or sects arising from it. And since this subject is an obligatory subject of study among us Plearin with regard to our psychological education, this subject is taught in all courses of all fields of work, subject areas of activity, and spheres of activity, which also require knowledge of psychology. My field of work also requires this knowledge, which is why I am also knowledgeable about the effects and all the facts relating to religions, belief in God, religious belief and religious sectarianism, etc. So I am also knowledgeable about the emergence and work of religions and sects, the origin of which always and in every case goes back to the authorship of a human being who places himself in the foreground and talks to the audience with suggestive words and impairs and confuses them in their intellect and reason, whereby they become believers in his suggestive influence. And that very many human beings do not understand themselves as the originator of all their thoughts, feelings, decisions, actions, and deeds, but are caught up in a belief that an external and higher power guides them and commands them, etc. So they very quickly accept another human being as a leader and saint and the like sent by a higher power and might, who suggestively preaches a teaching of faith to them to which they fall prey, although this is as a rule contrary to truth, reality, understanding, and reason. This happens because intellect and reason and their own thinking are switched off, and they let the teachings and leaders think for them in the opposite way. Consequently, they are no longer able to make their own decisions in order to develop within themselves by their own strength and to create their own inner balance, freedom, justice, and inner peace, and to live out these great values within themselves and also outwardly towards their fellow human beings and nature. Instead of this being done, however, human beings fall prey to the suggestive influence of false teachings and leaders who place themselves in the foreground and like to be admired and adored, so that they are elevated higher and higher and finally put on an equal footing, adored, worshipped, and glorified as messengers of a higher power and might, like a god. But this has always been the case, as I know from our studies and also from the experiences of Bermunda when, through her studies in the earthly past, she had gained the knowledge of very many religious machinations that had influenced her. And especially on Earth, she has gained knowledge concerning the origin of religions, and explains how already in early times the confused false teachings were spread, which are still being circulated and popularized in the same way as rumors, both by the main religions and also by ever newly emerging confused sects, which put traditional religious delusions into other forms. Old confused teachings, which have become religions and have also given rise to religious sectarianism, were inculcated into the believers suggestively early on, and are still being inculcated today by religious and other doctrinal representatives, so that the diffuse, confused, and unrealistic views and assertions regarding false religious teachings and belief systems will continue to be carried into the future, and the human beings will continue to be lied to and deceived by religious representatives and sect leaders regarding real reality and truth. Unfortunately, it also happened, as I learned and also experienced through the explanations of Bermunda, that on Earth also our common teaching of Nokodemion on Era, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which was brought by the ancient prophets and which you also teach, was completely falsified by Earth humans and became confused religions, from which also many sects emerged. And that this true teaching was not written down by the old prophets themselves was because they had no means to do so, which was also the case with the last two prophets. Also, these two taught only orally, and their disciples were ignorant of reading and writing, with one exception, for with the messenger Emmanuel there was a scribe named Judas Iscarioth, who however recorded more incidents than values of the teaching. Since the prophets could not record or write down the teachings themselves, it was not until many decades after their deaths that the possibility arose for scribes to create written records through extremely poor memories and false interpretations, as well as badly falsified oral traditions and stories. In the process, these also fell prey to new falsifications through their own interpretations, which were introduced by the scribes into their writings. Thus it could happen that the old prophets, against their will, were unintentionally elevated to the status of founders of religions after their death, although this was in fact absolutely not in their sense. Just as our population on Era was made aware of our Pleiar and mission with you before you were born, since then our attention has also been drawn again and again to all the monstrous criminal events on Earth, which have been staged and carried out since the emergence of Earth humans through their delusion of faith in higher forces and powers, in deities and other similar or similarly directed nonsense, have cost countless human lives, continue to be staged, and will also cost the lives of countless human beings in the future. Before I came to you, it was explained to me by Quetzal that you work in a special way with regard to your mission and that you yourself record in writing the teachings to be spread. So he explained the following to me. This time, under the sign of truth, you, the new and last herald from the Nokodemion line, are to prevent that on Earth, through lies and deceit as well as through intentional or unintentional falsifications. The teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life is once again mutilated with regard to authenticity, truth, and reality through religious and sectarian degenerations, and manipulated into religious delusion systems. Everything has been prepared for this, in that from the earliest time of your birth, you have been taught by our Pleiaran authorities, trained and made well-versed in language, writing, and many other values, through which you have also learned many skills, and you have prepared yourself for your mission. I have also arranged for all the necessary technical developments to take place on Earth, through which you can fulfill your work, and this time write down and spread the teaching yourself, interpreting it, unadulterated and true to the original. Only through this can falsifications no longer be possible, which, however, requires for the learning human beings that when they learn the teaching, they study and evaluate it only in your original version of your language. This necessity exists because foreign renditions and interpretations would also lead to new falsifications, just as translations into other languages do, which is why this time your original written version in your language is indispensable. But now this. So I know that religious, political, economic, philosophical, military as well as secret service sects, etc., exist as smaller religious communities with a hierarchical structure, whereby their views, beliefs, actions, and behavior are very often extremely degenerate, radical against all human rights, humanity and freedom, peace as well as against reality and truth, deviant and alien, as they also absolutely contradict the basic ethical values, common human sense, reason, and behavior true to reality, as well as the right of every personal freedom of the sect believers. Sects correspond to degenerations whose followers can be religiously, philosophically, or politically, but also criminally, or economically founded and oriented. Religious, political, and philosophical sectarianism is practiced by groups which, in accordance with their delusions of faith, trigger and spread contagious mass delusions contrary to real reality and thus also contrary to its incontrovertible and only truth. Sectarian groups differ from each other and also from themselves by their false teachings, actions, deeds and opinions as well as their cults or rituals, etc., as well as by all other prevailing confused, false and contradictory opinions and convictions and are usually in conflict with other sects, etc., but especially with regard to the fact that they are completely alien to reality and its truth, defensive, pathologically confused, and rejecting. Religious sects correspond to a religious community split off from a main or mother religion, whereby the originally value-neutral expression, which in Roman times referred to a following party or school, has acquired a religious character due to the history and shaping of religions and consequently also of religious linguistic usage. Our knowledge in this respect is that religious sects are more radical, more fanatical, and more alienated from reality than the actual main or mother religions from which sectarianism results. I must explain that we ply and judge and understand main religions and religious sects as the origin of a morbid, groundless madness of a perverse obsession with faith, which is deeply rooted in human consciousness and paralyses and disables understanding and reason through an impairing malignant misguidance. From this arises a confusion of consciousness, which makes it impossible for the human being to distinguish reality from unreality, whereby he is prevented from thinking, deciding and acting for himself and, in addition, through the suggestive persuasions of preachers, becomes dependent on religions and sects, dependent on them and becomes a blind, believing, obstinate and intolerant believer in what he builds up and practices in his consciousness as a delusion of religion and sectarianism. In this way, the human being who is addicted to faith becomes obsessed and dogmatic, as well as obstinate and unteachable, as a result of which he may even become a blind, fanatical advocate of his delusion of faith and unhesitatingly resort to violence and even murder, kill and destroy in order to advocate his fanatical delusion of faith and to live up to it. In all forms existing in this respect, the believer becomes and is in himself and outwardly in many ways contradictory, full of falsehood, discord, unfreedom, hatred, revengefulness, quarrelsomeness, and warmongering, and when he comes to the fore in these forms, then out of it comes everything up to evil fanaticism. Real truth, the right to life, peace, freedom, humanity, and justice, as well as all other values, are of no importance to a human being caught up in religious faith when acts of war, hatred, revenge, retaliation, jealousy, or punishment, etc., are at hand. For at such moments the religious delusion regarding love, justice, and forgiveness no longer applies, but only the urge for bloodshed, retaliation, and destruction, etc. The unreal nature of religious faith corresponds to a profound delusion which human beings who are addicted to religious or sectarian faith believe to be the only and correct truth, even if they suffer suffering, pain, and many evils as a result, because their delusion of faith makes them believe that everything is willed by God and that they will be tested or punished by this delusion. The real truth is not recognized by a believer in religion, but he is so addicted to untruth that he champions it to the point of self-destruction, because his faith has completely degenerated and he is intertwined with it and caught up in it in such a way that he accepts even the worst torture and his own death for it. But as far as my daughter Bermunda is concerned, it must be said that she has spent a great deal of time over the last 11 decades, and up to the present day, in studying the religious histories of Earth humans without a single gap. In doing so, she has also undertaken a large number of journeys to past times on Earth and to places of the various spreads of religion, and in doing so has directly witnessed and experienced many abominable, gruesome, and horrible religious degenerations on the spot of the events, which has led her to her rejection behavior towards religions and sects, religious faith and belief in God, etc., which is certainly to be understood and of right.
Contact Report 709.
Sanctions as a political weapon correspond to an attitude as sneaky, despicable, and degenerate as any kind of acts of war. If I may use your words, I would also like to say in this regard that political as well as other sanctions are stupid, primitive, and lunatic, and prove that the originators of such machinations are despotic, irresponsible elements who have a very horrendous lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligence, and thus also of a real, healthy, and righteous way in terms of a capacity for governing. Also, punitive tariffs as a political weapon against trade goods of foreign states, as imposed by Trump on various states, who is unfit for the office of U.S. President and should be removed from office, correspond to a primitive, intellectually deficient, irrational, and intelligence-poor way of acting and reprehensible reprisals. It has been proved since time immemorial that sanctions of any kind, so also punitive tariffs, etc., have never been a means of settling any differences between different states or even of bringing about good understanding and peace between them. On the contrary, through the fault of irresponsible contracting and megalomaniacal rulers and governors, only increased rejection, discord, difficulties, trade wars, as well as hatred, revenge, and ultimately insurrectionary armies, acts of terrorism, and wars among countries have resulted. However, these have always been fought not by the fallible female or male rulers, but by the populations and armies who have provoked wars through the delusion of power and the irresponsibility of the people in power and their high-handedness. And since the peoples and the armies never stood up to the government criminal and completely irresponsible and criminal machinations of the rulers of every kind, and did not refuse to take up arms and commit war murder, the whole thing has been maintained up to the present time and is being continued in an unchanged manner. And as long as the populations and armies of all countries do not refuse to engage in acts of war against alleged enemies, but on the contrary comply with the warmongering and peace-preventing activities of the ruling power-obsessed, and advocate and engage in acts of war, so long can no real peace and no effective freedom arise on earth and among all its humanity. What is the case in practically all states throughout the world at the present time, under the majority of inadequate, anti-peace and anti-people, conscienceless, irresponsible and power-obsessed leaderships of those in power in very many areas, does not correspond in any way to any form of peace, freedom, and justice, either for them or for their populations. On the contrary, the whole thing corresponds only to a state of threat in the form of a dangerous and dubious tranquility which threatens to break at any moment and can lead to armed conflicts, wars, or at least to long-lasting hostile differences between the countries, and thus also between the populations. And the fact that the populations, who in any case are always the ones who effectively suffer the most, howl along with the wolves of power of their governments, who conjure up everything evil and bad in the name of the peoples, results from the fact that the masses of the populations, as a result of their unconsciousness, lack of education, and inertia, are themselves incapable of questioning anything, of thinking for themselves, and of deciding and acting in the correct way. The fact is that the peoples, without being able to form their own rational and reasoned opinion, allow themselves to be lulled without hesitation by the suggestive lies, promises of lies and the like of all those fallible rulers, whereby these fallible rulers form the bulk of all rulers and co-rulers in all states of the earth, who create strife, discord, and lack of freedom, both in their own country and in other states. And as long as Earth humans continue to live in this weak state of consciousness and do not begin to think, consider, and act for themselves, but leave everything to the wrongly deciding, wrongly acting, and high-handed rulers, nothing will change for the better. The whole mass of Earth humans must at last find for themselves the right path to peace and freedom, first to themselves and then to the whole of Earth humans, as is shown, described and taught in many ways by the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, in relation to the personal thinking, decision-making, and action of the individual with regard to action.
I can only agree with this and hope that your words will find their way into the ears, minds, and reason of Earthlings. But if that will really be the case, it will only be in the distant future, if the great catastrophe you have announced sweeps away the majority of Earthlings. Unfortunately, it will be the case that the majority of Earth humans will continue not to learn the effective truth of life and existence, but will continue to vegetate thoughtlessly and want to err with regard to real reality for as long as they live. Hence, it will also be that the majority of human beings on Earth will continue to cheer and emulate all those erroneous and confused suggestive speeches, lies, deceptions, and false promises of the autocratic, government-unfit, irresponsible rulers. In the process, everything lying and criminal is also done to suppress and deny the real, effective reality and its truth, which could and would lead to a change for the good and the best, and into a future of effective worldwide peace, true freedom, and justice. Of course, I do not only mean the teaching of Nokodemion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which is spread by the Figu Association and myself, but also any other good and correct teaching of any Earthlings who have gained their own truthful knowledge concerning life, the environment, existence, the universe, consciousness, spirit energy, mind, reason, and intelligence, as well as especially the relevant human behavior, and who spread their valuable knowledge among the human beings of the earth. And it is indeed the case that many Earthlings have since time immemorial repeatedly gained and spread good, positive, and valuable knowledge, also with regard to spiritual teachings, but as a result of the ignorance of the peoples and their oppression by the rulers of the religions and sects as well as rulers and state powers, not much of it could really penetrate and therefore bring about only a few positive changes. This is also true of all that is good, correct, and true, which is undoubtedly also taught in many different religions and sects, etc. Although all religious sectarian posturing and posturing is excluded from real reality and its truth, in particular all the nonsense of imaginary forms, such as a god or deities, a son of God, divine prophets, divine saints, angels and devils, etc. But what I want to say about what you have said about sanctions and punitive tariffs is that I share your view about punitive tariffs. When such tariffs are levied on trade goods, as the U.S. ruler or the crazy, lying presidential oaf Trump is doing against other states with regard to various trade goods, then the trade exchange economy is disadvantaged. By imbecilically levying punitive tariffs, certain trade goods are made much more expensive, just as business people and consumers are also exploited by punitive tariffs levied by government-incapable pathological imbeciles, which amounts to a sheer irresponsible act of terrorism. And the fact that the oaf Trump, whose orders, actions, deeds, speeches, and governance correspond to those of a 6-year-old boy, is of course completely indifferent, and that with his idiotic actions and deeds he is also working against his own country. That is to say, the USA is creating enmity in various states, is something that he does not understand and, in his weakness of intelligence, is also unable to grasp, as are his advisors and all the others in his circle of government and the supporters from the people of the USA who support him. For my part, I have thought about this pompous and undignified guy, whereby I assess him in such a way that he is on the one hand megalomaniac and on the other hand domineering, as it is written in the dictionary. Furthermore, I can recognize in his whole behavior and conduct a serious defect of mind, reason, and intelligence, although I cannot ascertain whether this defect of consciousness, coupled with a certain amount of imbecility, is congenital, or whether he acquired it himself in his early childhood or adolescence as a result of his great stupidity and emotional disability. His intelligence defect, which is clearly evident to me, and his inconsistency with regard to his own statements and instructions, etc., also reveal his absurd and foolish behavior, as well as his fickleness and lying, as well as his constant changing and revoking of given instructions, and the respective thoughtless, vehement and quick denial of negative facts which are made known about him, his behavior, actions, and deeds. In my opinion, this man is dominated by an obsession with himself, as well as by a cognitive distortion of his personality and an overestimation of his own skills and competencies. As is unfortunately the case worldwide with many female and male government leaders of all colors, he is an element of extreme form in terms of almost boundless self-overestimation, self-congratulation, self-aggrandizement, and even self-glorification, which is particularly expressed when he signs decrees etc., and provocatively raises them in the presence of a large group of people who admire him, and demonstratively exposes them for the spectators and journalists. For me, however, a loss of reality is also recognizable, and in addition, everything is also characterized in such a way that I would like to call it hubris, a self-conceit, presumption and haughtiness, arrogance and presumptuousness. The whole of Trump's personality is also connected to a loss of reality, in that he has overestimated his own abilities, achievements and competencies, as is usually the case with persons who hold positions of power, especially in government positions, but also in positions of civil servants and superiors, although these human beings, including Trump, are not aware of this fact. Such persons can also be found among all kinds of other potentates, that is to say, rulers, leaders, spokespersons, territorial leaders, regents, chiefs, headmen, commanders, holders of power, holders of authority, country leaders, bosses, commanders, and emperors. The elements falling into this round dance live under a delusion in which they believe themselves to be a very important personality, and in this way are addicted to gigantomania and megalomania, but they also live under the delusion that they must and would surpass their fellow human beings in their striving for and acting in power by exaggerated achievements, which is not usually the case because such persons turn out to be rather human rivets and zeros.
That can be assumed. However, the reason why this new controversy is being sought is based on two important factors, namely, firstly, the maliciousness of fighting against that which generally brings personal progress to Earth humans with regard to becoming truly human, the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. This teaching, however, is prevented by all means of lies, deceit, and slander, mainly by the leaders and believers of religions and sects, but also by politics and thus also by secret governmental machinations. The teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, which you bring, teach and spread, and which can indisputably bring to Earth humans their very own life, according to positive creative laws, as well as real interpersonal peace and freedom, and thus good interpersonal relationships, is the most valuable teaching ever brought and taught to Earth for the revolution of consciousness in relation to true humanity, and is now being taught anew. It was indeed brought and taught in ancient times, but it was maliciously falsified by misunderstanding Earth humans, and false religions, and sects were created from it, from which a great deal of evil and mischief has been produced up to the present time. Unfortunately, this will also continue to be the case in the far future, because the malicious power of the religions, sects, and their representatives, who may be believers, but are nevertheless irresponsible, continue to vehemently promote the fanaticism-induced faith of the sanctimonious, uncritical, naive, and clueless followers of the faith. Thereby, through suggestive influencing powers of faith-promoting elements of various kinds, helpless faith-label persons, who are searching for real truth of life and for a real expansion of their consciousness, are unhesitatingly and irresponsibly seduced into new believers and driven into religious and sectarian fanaticism and delusion. The second malignant factor in the new controversy being sought is to nip in the bud your and the Figu-E's and their members' efforts in relation to the disastrous consequences of overpopulation and to slander them as lies, conspiracy theories, nonsense, fantasy, and do-gooder theories. There are already corresponding activities and defamatory undertakings in this regard, which are intended to prevent your open dissemination of the truth, and thus also to name the truth of the actual causes of climate change, the destruction of nature, fauna, and flora, and of the planet itself. So the irresponsible machinations of excessive overpopulation are to be concealed, or at least trivialized, which are to blame for all the natural catastrophes, destructions, and the death of many Earth humans that are already occurring worldwide and are steadily getting worse and worse. But this also obscures and even deliberately prevents the truth that all planetary reasonableness with regard to a human population that is ideally sustainable for the Earth has long since been exceeded by a factor of 16. Furthermore, it is also concealed because it is not to be recognized and also not to be known that the unstoppably increasing brutality, violence, indifference, lack of conscience, the murdering, killing, terrorizing, the compulsions and the warfare, as well as the entire criminality and the criminal system in the entire earthly humanity are constantly increasing and becoming more precarious and degenerating more and more. Already in the families, through wrong and miseducation, the causes begin to form, to shape the offspring for all kinds of degenerations, which ultimately also bring malicious negative effects on the environment, nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet itself. And in this respect, everything increases and worsens in such a way that the wrongly and miseducated offspring themselves also carelessly produce and bring into the world offspring who then, also like their parents, in relation to the real reality and truth, with their degenerating, criminal, and felonious machinations, also ruthlessly bring death, extinction, destruction, and annihilation in nature, fauna, and flora, and also promote them more and more. Furthermore, it is a given that organized groups hostile to order, peace, and freedom, and also elements acting in the governments, are creating new challenges and divergences, with lies, deceit, defamatory hostilities, hatred, envy and speculation, and contradictions based on paradoxes, as well as all kinds of malicious machinations, are intended to mislead Earth humans, thereby impairing their intellect and reason and preventing human beings from creating peace and freedom within themselves and between peoples. Basically, Earth humans should not find the way to real reality and truth, because only by being beguiled in their entire mass by lies, deceit, violence, and coercion, which is especially the case through the suggestive whisperings of faith by those in power, rulers and leaders of religions and sects, but also by the falseness and self-importance of the fallible leaders of power in politics. The Earth humans can be enchantingly easily directed as the bulk of the masses, held down and kept under control in religious, sectarian, and political expediency. In this way, Earth humans have been directed, ruled, governed, persuaded and commanded, kept under supervision and monitored by the majority of rulers and representatives of religions, sects and politicians, and ruling powers of all colors since time immemorial. In the process, everything that has kept the power of the religions and sects, respectively their rulers and representatives, as well as the politicians, rulers, and those in power alive, and also continues to keep them alive, has been surreptitiously promoted with all malicious lies, false promises, and machinations. And this has been able to happen since time immemorial, as it is also the case today, because the peoples, on the one hand, do not free themselves from their religious, sectarian delusion, and do not turn to the real reality and truth, and not to the fact that they themselves alone are and possess that power and might, through which they make every decision themselves and carry out every action on their own responsibility, and likewise perform every deed according to their own will, and that without a deity doing this for them, or being able to do so, because all deities correspond to nothing other than morbid, stupid imaginings of the believers. On the other hand, the same principle applies in a modified way to politics, rulers and governors, etc., because the peoples themselves usually elect their rulers, leaders and rulers, so that they are also responsible for what their elected rulers do, how they act, govern, and thus exercise their governmental office and power potential as a whole. In this way, however, it has been the case from time immemorial that the peoples, in their ignorance and lack of knowledge of human nature, etc., and without knowledge of human nature, etc., elected and acclaimed their rulers, state leaders, and rulers without recognizing their intentions. Consequently, in every case, only urge, violence and coercion resulted from everything, as is also still the case, because the people, in their stupidity, lack of knowledge of human nature and ignorance, elect the wrong persons to positions of government and power. After that, discontent, strife, and finally uprisings and acts of violence arise from the whole thing, from which the peoples then have to suffer, whereby, however, they themselves have elected their oppressive rulers and brought them into their positions, to which you once said in a comparison that stupid calves choose their butchers themselves. Through all that I have explained so far, it is absolutely impossible for individual Earth humans and for the whole of Earth humanity to find the way to peace, freedom, truth, justice, and to knowledge that is in accordance with reality, either intrinsically within themselves or within society and the mass of the whole of humanity. In fact, everything is to be prevented also with regard to good interpersonal relations, as well as with regard to peace and freedom in uniting friendships, deep relations, and between the different peoples among themselves. If peace and freedom were to come about in the Earth humans themselves, and thereby also in all peoples, then the religions would lose power among their believers, and their false teachings would become useless, because the believers would inevitably recognize that the Earth human being alone is master of himself, as well as of his thoughts, feelings, decisions, actions, and deeds, and not a god or other supposedly divine savior. Every political disunity, the non-thinking of the people as well as the opinions propagated and suggested by the ruling rulers must comprehensively take hold of the people and become their own. Consequently, they must be maintained by all means, and thus secure their positions for that part of the unrighteous rulers who act against the good of their peoples, harass them in many ways, and enrich themselves pecuniarily to their detriment, which leads to hatred and envy, etc. Hatred, envy, and slander have no expiry date when it comes to preventing something that is real, good and valuable, such as the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life which you teach and spread, and through which love, peace, freedom, equality, and justice can arise in Earth humans themselves and be spread throughout the entire Earth population. To prevent the spread of this teaching, and thus your work and mission in this respect, is to be the purpose of the controversy, which is again to be brought into being by religious believers, envious people, know-it-alls, as well as by certain authoritative authorities and other adversaries throughout the world, namely by inventing untrue circumstances about you and accusing you of lies and deceitfulness through various machinations. So again slander and falsehoods shall arise, that your film and photo material concerning our flying apparatus shall be forgery, swindling, charlatanry, swindling, and even maleficence. This, as before, is to be connected with malicious and insidious provocations of every conceivable kind in relation to your personality, especially attacks which could also endanger your safety again, but under certain circumstances also that of your family and the Figu club members. So, malicious disparagement, belittling, ridiculing, denigrating, defaming, insulting, and discriminating will continue to take place, and in this regard, everything will be kept alive and continue until far into the future. Consequently, these intrigues will lead to a never-ending spiral full of untruths and will be continuously preserved until far into the future. For our part, although we will endeavor to control all these defamatory and also threatening activities, etc., as far as possible, as decided by our committee, we cannot give any guarantee that certain attacks will fall outside our control. Furthermore, it must be explained that by spreading ever more intensely and extensively, increasing and fanatically degenerating faith lies and faith deceptions by sectarian religious believers worldwide, Earth humans are to be prevented from finding themselves and recognizing that it is not a god or any other higher power that has to decide on personal actions and deeds, etc., but only the human being alone in every way and manner. Thus, in the present and in the coming times, believers afflicted with religious delusion will again push up the old-fashioned lies and deceptions of faith with renewed efforts to drive Earth humans once more into a religious faith, and thus into a state which, as in earlier times, can bring evil degenerations. Connected with this is also the addiction to power and the greed for profit of many rulers and business tycoons, etc., who irresponsibly know how to use the delusion of faith of countless Earth humans and fanatize them, whereby in particular an increase in the readiness to use violence and the exercise of violence arises, which moreover also increases in relation to the unrestrainedly excessive growth of Earth human overpopulation. And this readiness to use violence and violence of all kinds, which already begins with verbal violence in the upbringing of children and in the course of life degenerates into physical and deadly violence, has for some time now been gaining the upper hand worldwide. The whole thing begins in the family and continues to spread throughout Earth human being society, especially in politics, in the actions of the security forces, the military, as well as in the actions of superiors, etc., and of course especially in religions and sects, where the violent powers of many religious representatives do not shy away from rape, threats, and much more evil. The mass of Earth human overpopulation has risen to almost 9 billion since your foreboding warnings to the rulers and media, etc., which you wrote worldwide in the 1940s and 1950s, when the Earth humans did not yet amount to 3 billion, whereby the factor of that has already been exceeded, by which the steadily increasing readiness for violence and exercise of violence of the Earth humans could still be controlled and prevented. In fact, the future will show that the readiness to use violence and its exercise will continue to spread in an unimagined way and in many different forms throughout the entire society of all peoples, and will bring a great deal of suffering, death, disaster, and destruction, and will no longer be able to be contained. In this way, however, it will not only be the terrorist cells, which for decades have brought disaster and destruction as well as torture, massacres and many deaths, misery and hardship upon Earth humans, because everything of this kind is now inexorably spreading more and more. Therefore, it will increasingly be innumerable degenerate individuals, as well as elements of the normal bourgeois Earth population gathering together in small or larger groups, who will in future more frequently and brutally commit violence in public in an ever more unhesitating and uncontrolled manner, and indeed much worse than has been the case for years in increasing measure, with which fear, terror, suffering, distress, damage, and tribulation will be spread among many righteous Earth humans. To this, I think it is to be borne in mind that all those Earth humans who bring forward corresponding questions to you, as well as the entire Earth Human Guild of Astronomical Sciences, are in this respect not included in the education which my father Svath has bestowed upon you concerning creation and its dimensions, as well as universes and space-time structures, as well as the past, present, and future.
But it is still tedious to be pestered again and again with these questions, which are, after all, really only knowledge-based, but not consciousness evolution-based, and thus also not of a spirit teaching, aka creation energy-based matter.
That is probably also correct, but...
Of course, I know that as a rule, sheer curiosity is confused with a thirst for knowledge, but in the process precisely that which is fundamentally of importance and significance. The teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, or the teaching of the spirit, comes short, is given short shrift. It is always the case that you have to do something yourself, and enough if you want to climb a green branch. So I also want to see to it and do everything possible to make my arm fully functional again, even when the pain is going crazy, which is especially the case with movement exercises and certain work activities, as well as when I am working on the computer. I only hope that I will really succeed, and that the nasty risk diagnoses will not come to the fore, as they have been painted as the consequences of not having the operation. But now enough should really have been said about this, because there are more important things to discuss, such as something concerning the death rune peace symbol, the so-called CND symbol, whereby a few things should be explained about this, because this alleged peace symbol causes tremendous harm and mischief, and the Earthlings do not understand that this false symbol is the origin of discord, war, hatred, death and ruin, etc. This is in complete contrast to the real peace symbol, as Nokodemion designed and created millions of years ago, and also brought it into the spiritual teachings as a spiritual teaching symbol,